Hey, thanks for checking out The Solid Verbal. Now would be a great time to subscribe to the channel for college football content all off season long.
Welcome back to The Solid Verbal. Boys and girls, my name's Ty Hildebrandt. As always, that fine-looking gentleman over there, the one, the only, still the incomparable after all these years, Dan Rubenstein, sir. How goes it in Chicago?
Still the one I don't want to get in trouble by the people that get copyright music stuff in trouble. I'm good. Ty, I love signing day, signing days, signing day year. I love recruiting because it's insane. It's the thing that sets college football and I suppose college basketball apart from the rest of the insane world of sports. And if you wanted to introduce somebody to college football, there are three things that make absolutely no sense in terms of what people have as a reference point for major sports. And recruiting is at the top of that list. Now that the postseason is beginning to resemble what other postseasons look like in baseball and football or NFL football, the recruiting stuff is so, like, if you wanted to genuinely get somebody from Belgium, from Chile into college football, and you would have to say, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure? The first thing you do is you take them to a tailgate in a game and you let them soak in the culture. The second thing you do is you sit down and you try to explain the nonsense, beautiful nonsense that is recruiting. We are here today to make sense of a bunch of major classes and trends within the sport and early impact guys, but I treasure that it's what sets us apart from the other animals, Ty. I do.
I think that's a great way of looking at it. Yeah. We appreciate one and all stopping on by. It is college football, quote unquote, off season. Doesn't mean there's not news. Doesn't mean there's not goings on. Doesn't mean that there isn't a second, we got two of them, signing day.
Yeah.
2 signing days now. Once was not enough, hasn't been enough for a couple of years now. Now we got 2 of them. There were a lot of names that were already kind of set in stone going into today, but we've got a little bit more clarity as a result of some of the names that have moved about, have flipped, have not flipped, what have you. We're going to go through that in a little bit more detail here over the next 45 minutes to an hour or so. Don't forget to hit subscribe if you have yet to do so. If you're just finding us, welcome on in. Thanks for stopping by. We'll be with you twice a week from now until the start of the season, or at least until we get closer to the start of the season. You can also go on out to verballers.com. That is VERBALLERS.com. Officially enshrine your place in the Verballerhood by signing up to be either a certified or premium Verballer. We've got all sorts of benefit tiers that are available to you.
Mm-hmm.
Tomorrow, we're recording this on a Wednesday. So every Thursday, we record something we call the Brew and A. It's a bonus episode, only available to the fine folks in the Patreon Verballerhood. We also have Discord access. We also have off-topic episodes that we're going to be lining up throughout the course of this very long, cold, dismal off season. We will do our part to keep it sunny and bright and warm, Dan. Yeah. Again, that is verballers.com for anybody interested. Last but certainly not least, make sure you follow along on social media and go on out to our YouTube channel where we post clips from this show, from all of our episodes. It is youtube.com/thesolidverbal or at the little @ sign.
Just at, yeah.
Solid Verbal, going out there. Make sure you hit subscribe.
So this year's class, I don't know if there's any specific news you want to get into. I mean, look, the news kind of happened today with a couple of relatively high-profile commitments. Jaden Rashada to Arizona State, his, I think, 3rd commitment. I don't know if the paperwork is in, but obviously a complicated recruitment in that it appears he got mixed up, maybe through his own doing, maybe through others doing, in some NIL drama. But hopefully this marks the beginning of a football narrative for Jaden Rashada and ASU.
I'm surprised he would pick ASU, that he's got to compete with Drew Pine. So it's probably not a... I'm just kidding. Jaden Rashada appears to be the number 1 there in Tempe.
I don't know if he's going to start this year. I imagine Drew Pine will probably get the first look just because making
please
that
don't. Please don't.
Really?
Oh, come on.
Okay, he's a legacy. Jaden Rashada is a legacy at Arizona State, and the expectations for him, the expectations for ASU are bottom of the barrel right now.
That's right.
because of the amount of roster turnover, because of how many transfers are coming in, because of the looming NCAA attention with Arizona State, which is a nice place to be, right? If you are somebody who's going to be saddled with expectations because of the spotlight that comes with being a high-profile quarterback with high-profile commitments and decommitments, go somewhere where expectations are pretty moderate.
I agree. I would start Jaden Rashada over Drew Pine if he turned around and threw lefty. That's how I feel about that circumstance. We can get more into it as the season draws near and as we find out a little bit more about what Jaden Rashada looks like against college competition. But just coming from where I've been over the last 6 to 8 months or so, I'll take what I don't know over what I think I do.
So this new non-early signing period signing day is pretty much drama-free every year just because so many people are trying to enroll early and thus commit early to get a jump on their college seasons. Nick Harbour, 5-star athlete, I think the number 1 athlete in the country, chose South Carolina over Oregon. Track star, and I think he's going to play offense. He was considered to be a 5-star because of his ability and potential playing defense on the edge, but speed to burn, obviously, as a high-level sprinter. So South Carolina with an incredible recruiting coup today. He visited Oregon last weekend, who they themselves can offer a lot in the world of track and field. I saw Michigan flipped a Stanford commit. Cameron Brandt, a defensive lineman, a longtime Stanford commitment, who obviously when David Shaw resigned, seemed to open things back up. Walker Lyons, a top flight tight end who is actually delaying his enrollment a little bit, going on an LDS mission, a little bit of a surprise going to USC.
Saw that.
There, Roderick Pleasant, a top flight corner, also a track guy, going to Oregon from Southern California. That was an Oregon USC battle. I presume there will be a number of Oregon USC battles in the years to come when Dan Lanning and Lincoln Riley are at both of those respective schools. I saw Alabama pulled off Desmond Ricks, a blue chip corner.
Did you see Alabama's class?
The number 3 class of all time.
Only the number 3 class of all time, but won this cycle. It was Alabama, Georgia, 1-2. Won this cycle. Did set a record, though, with respect to 5 stars.
Yeah.
There were 9 5 stars as part of this class. Keon Keeley, the edge rusher. They also had Quay Russell. I probably said his name incorrectly. Yanje Pierre, probably another one I said incorrectly. I apologize.
Justice Haynes, the running back.
We had Caleb Downs. We have Caden Proctor, James Smith, Justice Haynes, Jalen Hale, and as you mentioned, Desmond Ricks. That's all 9 of them. And that, look, talent at Alabama is never in short supply, but they are clearly loading up here.
Yeah, Caden Proctor was a longtime Iowa commit from Iowa, seemed to come down to Iowa, Oregon, and Alabama at the end there, where he flipped his commitment to Alabama. So, it's rich get richer. This is no surprise. Alabama has earned, obviously, the attention that recruits give to them and are able to sign with Alabama in droves every year, the top flight kids. So not a surprise there. I don't know if there are any surprises in the top 10, top 15, top 20. It's an interesting time with recruiting just because you'll see the average rating of a commit be pretty high, but a school only take 15, whereas another school takes 29. And there's this conversation about priorities, whether or not a school is hitting the portal really hard, like the LA schools or Michigan State. A number of schools are choosing to go that route instead of pushing a lot of their eggs into the high school basket. So did anybody else stand out to you as like, oh, look at that, they're there, or ooh, they're not there?
Yeah, to be honest with you, Notre Dame at 10 stands out to me, if only because they were 1 for a good long time during this recruiting cycle. The writing's been on the wall that they weren't going to finish 1 and that they could finish where they did. But Notre Dame at 10, still a really good class, 24 stars. We'll talk more about Notre Dame's class here and maybe some instant impact guys as we go through. But Notre Dame at 10, I think is one that jumps out to me. I would also throw Oklahoma in there. Oklahoma at Texas and Oklahoma at 3 and 4. Mm-hmm. Texas with a very strong class. We've talked about that, but Oklahoma, didn't have the season many expected, but still recruited really, really hard this cycle and got up to number 4, which, I think is a testament to that staff and how hard they're working. Heard a lot of doom and gloom about Florida, but Florida is still, 13th, right behind USC. Still a pretty good class for the Gators. Mm-hmm. And South Carolina, look, you mentioned South Carolina before, but South Carolina all the way up at at 16, I think is notable. Obviously getting the big signing here at the end with Nick Harbor. Yeah. I mean, that's a huge deal, right, to help boost that ranking. But just in terms of the SEC, South Carolina coming in 7th behind Texas A&M and ahead of Auburn, Arkansas, Mississippi State, even Ole Miss to finish where they did. I think just continued steam on Shane Beamer. Beamer ball, as Harbor called out when he announced that he was going to go to Columbia, South Carolina instead. There's definitely something afoot there. And if you're a South Carolina fan, I think you got to be thrilled.
Oh, absolutely. No, so this year, to me, the first thing is it's a quarterback year. It is just because of the top of the quarterback rankings list, whether it's Arch Manning or Malachi Nelson or
Dante
Nick
Moore,
Yamaleva.
Jackson Arnold.
Yeah. So the big thing is when you have a class like this and what we perceive to be Jaden Rashada, Arizona State, what we perceive to be depth of possibly incredible quarterbacks at the top, you're spreading talent around in ways that we haven't necessarily seen at the top of the sport. So what does that mean for UCLA? What does that mean for Oklahoma, who is used to getting top flight quarterback talent, obviously, these past few years when Lincoln Riley was running the show? Hopefully it means more at the top of the sport, that you have a game changer at quarterback. And if it's Tennessee, who definitely had it this past year, but you have that guy for maybe 2-3 years down the road developing within that system, as opposed to Hendon Hooker and Joe Milton transferring in. What does that mean for his ceiling? I think it's a fascinating year at quarterback. There's a guy, K-State got a quarterback. It's Avery. You might have it in front of you.
Yeah, Avery Johnson.
Avery Johnson, that a ton of people think incredibly highly of, and maybe in a way that K-State hasn't had that high school commitment who has needed to develop. I think he's like a 2 or 3 sports star. So that kind of depth at the top of the sport, I think, can only be a good thing, especially if we see a number of these guys in an expanded playoff. That seems to be a win for everybody who wants that quality in a deeper field.
On today's show, what I think we're going to try and do is go through, what do we got, 10 teams here? Something like that?
Yeah.
We want to evaluate where things stand with a bunch of different schools in terms of what is going out, what is coming in, which players we could see from this class making an impact.
Sure.
And really just in looking at the class as a whole, what does it tell us about the health of the program? What does it tell us about their priorities? Does that mesh with what we saw this season over the last couple seasons? For some places like Georgia, I'll talk about Georgia. Georgia is in a much, much different class than most of college football. If you're coming in as a freshman, there's a pretty good chance, much like you'll see at Ohio State, some other places, Alabama is probably another great example, maybe one of the only, where if you're coming in as a freshman, there's a pretty good chance that the best you're going to do is get to the second team. There's enough depth from recruiting successes of years past that in order to crack that top line, you got to be pretty damn good. That's not to say it doesn't happen. It happens all the time. But that is, I think, where we start the conversation with some of those truly elite programs. As we work down a little bit, then we start talking about, all right, who's plug and play? Who can step in and who can immediately make a difference? I'm going to talk about Notre Dame as well. There are some guys in this class that could step in and make an instant impact for Notre Dame. They don't quite have that level of depth that we'll talk about with Alabama, Georgia,
right,
et cetera. So it obviously is a different conversation depending on the team. But I think across the board here with all these teams that we're going to discuss, some really interesting names that make the conversation quite intriguing at this early stage of 2023.
Yeah, and the SEC in particular, just because you mentioned Georgia, they finished number 2 with a paltry 5 stars instead of Alabama's 9. The SEC is fascinating because you can finish, 8th, 9th, 10th in the conference and have a top 15 class, a top 20 class, just because the area is so rich with talent. Ole Miss is one of those schools that doesn't recruit a ton because they're, Lane Kiffin, the self-described portal king, 14 commitments in this class. But the blue chip ratio is there, 7 blue chips, 7 non-blue chips. And they're ranked at 11 in the SEC with a 50% blue chip ratio. You mentioned Florida, Tennessee in the top 5 within the SEC. Not a surprise that LSU and Georgia are right there in the top 4 with Alabama. But no, it's wild to me that if Georgia puts together this class in, 6 of the last 10 years or something like that, it's winning everything.
It's winning everything, yeah.
And then Alabama is just paced ahead. So what stands out to you about the defending champion, the two-time defending champion, Georgia Bulldogs, and what they did?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost predictable. It's a Kirby Smart team, and the focus of this class, just by sheer numbers, is on both offensive and defensive line. It all starts up front. Thank you, David Pollack.
Yep, of course.
And defensive back. So trying to replenish the lines, trying to get good in the secondary. As you said, the number 2 overall class, they had what appeared to be a glaring weakness in air quotes,
of course,
at receiver. Big question at receiver. Of course, Brock Bowers is back. Of course, Ladd McConkey is back. But with A.D. Mitchell leaving, it's like, all right, Georgia wants to get a little bit more downfield. They've done it, but
Sure.
They want to do more of it. And I think adding some ammo at receiver can help them do that. So as opposed to addressing that as prominently through the recruiting game, they're very active in the portal. Now, there was an arrest of a gentleman who
Rah-rah
came over from Mississippi State, which does not help. I have not seen an update on that status, but they've been active enough in the portal that I think they'll be just fine. The name that obviously comes to mind, somebody who's going to step in, is Dominic Lovick. We talked about him on the show, on the transfer portal show that we did a couple weeks ago. He's someone who I think will come in, give them depth, give them productivity out wide. So I don't focus my attention as much there with this 23 class as I do, again, guys who you could see stepping up and maybe making some hay on that second team level.
Sure.
The name that stands out to me, and maybe it's only because of his size, I don't know, but Jamal Jarrett. Have you heard the name Jamal Jarrett, Dan?
No. Please expand on Jamal Jarrett.
Yeah, Jamal Jarrett, is 6'6", 340.
Oh, sure.
He's a big dude. And you can never have enough depth along the defensive line, especially if you've got a guy who is that size on the defensive line.
Mm-hmm.
I got to believe you find a way to plug him in. The comp has been Jordan Davis, who was obviously another standout for the Georgia Bulldogs along the defensive line.
Mm-hmm.
He has got that kind of build and that kind of frame. When Jordan Davis was there, we saw him also break into the twos his freshman year back in 2018, whenever that was. So I could see Jarrett taking on a much, much similar path, just given the fact that he's so damn big. And if he does possess that Jordan Davis skill set, obviously Kirby Smart's going to have a place for him.
Oh, yeah, of course. And you look at even last year's class, the guys who saw the field quickly, Mikael Williams, Malachi Starks obviously made an early impact. And it's one of those luxuries that a team like Georgia, that a program like Georgia has, is when you're up 34-3 at the top of the third quarter, suddenly you can play freshmen. Suddenly you can play your twos, your threes, and they're getting a ton of playing time. And so if physically that guy is ready, as you said, Jamal Jarrett?
Jamal Jarrett, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know the kind of weight he's carrying. That's a big deal as well. If he has the energy, if he has the motor at 340 pounds, if he should be paying at 315 or something like that, I guess yet to be seen. But yeah, these guys, especially Glenn Schumann and Will Muschamp, are going to continue the whole thing of just like rotating in guys, legs fresh. And so Georgia's going to be at a good place, lose a couple of big name guys in this year's class, heading off to the NFL, and Keely Ringo, Jalen Carter, some of the headliners there.
Sure.
But yeah, I expect, even if these guys don't play a ton from this class, the top of this class, whether it's a receiver, whether it's a defensive lineman, I just expect if they are there physically, if the fitness is there, that they're going to see the field so Kirby Smart can see what he has in this year's class.
Yeah, I mean, and look, when I talk about Jamal Jarrett, I'm not even talking about some of the highest rated guys in this class.
Right.
Right. I mean, it's an incredible class. It was 2 overall. What do you say? 5 stars.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's Damon Wilson, the edge rusher out of Florida, Raylan Wilson, the linebacker out of Florida, Monroe Freeling, the big offensive tackle, I don't know if he will get work. It's a good spot for him because Georgia's been good at developing offensive tackles as of late. So whenever he gets in, he's in a good spot. Like, they've got guys here that are far even above Jamal Jarrett in terms of recruiting ranking.
Right.
And I suppose there's always an opportunity for those guys. But I just think if I'm trying to pick a name from this big list, his size is really appealing to me. And that comp, whenever I see Jordan Davis, it's like, all right, I remember where we were when Jordan Davis was getting all sorts of draft hype.
Sure.
So that's a guy who you would think could come in and make an impact. A 4-star in his own right out of North Carolina.
So the other class that I'm especially interested in because of the early success they had in the SEC is LSU. Is Brian Kelly and his first full, it's really not his first one will be next year when you have that kind of time to build those relationships. But wins the West, beats Alabama in year one, starts terribly, and things turn around. Jaden Daniels has a very nice season. What did LSU focus on? I know they hit the portal hard once again as they sort of overhaul things from the end of the Ed Orgeron era. Where do you stand with LSU right now?
Where do I stand with LSU? I've had to come around on LSU because LSU had such a good season. I mean, it was an incredible first year for Brian Kelly in Baton Rouge. Say whatever I will as a scorned Notre Dame fan about his inability to manage a quarterback situation or, any disingenuous qualities that he might have with him as a coach.
Well, he's at a big-time place now, Ty.
He's at a big-time place, and the guy wins.
Yeah.
The guy just wins. He knows how to win. So in terms of this recruiting class, as you said, pretty active in the portal. Bunch of guys coming in. It seems in the portal especially, they're very active on defense. There are a number of cornerbacks that they brought in, a couple linemen, some edge rushers that can step in and hopefully make an impact. But the focus, I think, predominantly just through the recruiting game was out wide.
Yeah.
Was out wide. By my count, 5 or 6 receivers as part of this class. Jalen Brown, 5-star, out of Florida. Kyle Parker, 4-star, out of Texas. We have other guys here. Sheldon Sampson Jr., 4-star, out of Louisiana, hometown kid. I could go down the list here of other guys that they added as part of this class, but the point is that I think they were very, very active there, and it's for good reason. They are hoping that they can build this thing and add depth, add playmakers, and as they move beyond Jaden Daniels, whenever that ends up being, right, after next season, that they can have those playmakers out wide, some of the guys that we're used to seeing at LSU, right? That's, I don't know, something that that I think of often when I think of the Bayou Bengals, right? Some of the notable wide receiver talent that's come out of there in recent years. So that for sure was a focus. I mentioned defensive back. Again, I harken back to this, not as much a focus in the quote unquote recruiting game, at least not the freshman recruiting game, but definitely something they were aggressive through the portal in trying to beef up. So I think that tells you a lot about where Brian Kelly wants to try and make this team better. He wants to focus on adding playmakers out wide, certainly adding some air cover through the back. And then if you're trying to pick out a secondary focus, you're talking about the lines. It's exactly what it did at Notre Dame. It's a much, much similar model to what it did at Notre Dame. You're going to add some offensive linemen. You're going to add some defensive linemen. You're going to try and build from the inside out and start there. If nowhere else, start there. That was the sustainable model that worked really well at Notre Dame. I'd imagine those efforts in the SEC have to be doubled. The SEC is a line league. If you don't have a line in the SEC, you're going to get blown off the ball. You're not going to win games. Brian Kelly's smart enough to know that. So that's also why that area was a focus. It's been a focus for many of these top teams that we're discussing. I think you're going to see a recurring trend. But for sure, that is where he focused here as part of this 23 class. This is a really good class. Look, I mean, I think 3rd in the SEC, 7th overall, 6th overall, 6th overall. So, this was a really, really strong class for Brian Kelly. Maybe his first truly full cycle since he stepped foot on campus. And it's good to see, if you're an LSU fan, the kind of work he did here. There's definitely steam on the Tigers.
Yeah, and you get a sense for what he thinks, and it's not necessarily going to be a 2023 thing, but what he thinks the roster lacks. And when you look at what LSU was good and not as good at doing this season, it was making plays downfield consistently. All due respect to Malik Neighbors, Keyshawn Butte, and they actually showed up really nicely for a chunk of that Georgia SEC championship game. But I think they finished 100. You can look at this. It was like 121st in explosive passing, and 89th in explosive passing allowed. And so They hit DB relatively hard. I know you said that it wasn't a huge priority this year, but I think safety seemed to be a priority to lock up the back half of that field, whoever it is, both locally in state and in Texas. And so that gives you an indication of where Brian Kelly and his staff think the roster is and where it isn't. And so, yeah, I think it's a huge, and it's a huge degree of addressing an immediate need right now. And if they can find a guy in that list that you mentioned at receiver, goes a long way this year when you're bringing back a sixth-year guy or whatever in Jaden Daniels, and you have the experience you bring back on offense. It's, chips to the center of the table for this passing game right now.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm talking about impact guys that can step in, right? So one of the drawbacks, if we're trying to pick out that name, especially in a class that did emphasize to some extent receiver, suddenly the receiver room's kind of crowded, right?
Yeah.
Suddenly you've got a bunch of names in there that you got to worry about. The one that I come back to, I think, is Jaylen Brown. I really like him.
He's from Florida?
Yeah, he's from Miami. He's a guy that has, gotten, I think, second, third round grades per the scouts over at 24/7. Not the biggest receiver in the world, but definitely somebody who, is a playmaker, somebody they can put in space, someone that they can get some yards after the catch, that type. I don't know if he'll be able to get a little bit bigger as part of being an early enrollee, being on campus earlier, strength and conditioning, the whole 9 yards there. But Jaylen Brown's a guy on offense that I think is really interesting as somebody who could potentially step in and find his way. The big name, though, I think, is Deshaun Womack. He was their 5-star edge rusher. He's from Maryland, so it was a nice pull to get him to come south for Brian Kelly. His comp's been Bud Dupree from the Titans. So, that tells you pretty much everything you need to know about this guy. There is definitely a need along this defensive line for LSU to bring somebody in to replace some of the outgoing production. And if you can get after the passer, that's going to help as well. So he's a guy, just given his grade, just given what we know about his skill set, you could see him almost being plug and play.
Pretty nice to have when you return arguably the best defensive player in the country in Harold Perkins.
I know,
to
right?
Bring in. So obviously Matt House and Brian Kelly not afraid of playing youth on defense. And so, yeah, you add him to Harold Perkins, even if it's just a rotation guy. Sometimes you look at the guys who are coming in as edge players. They're not going to play a ton of snaps. They're not 3-down guys. But if you have a specialized guy on the edge who can say see quarterback, hit quarterback on 3rd and 9, and you have specific packages for him, it makes a ton of sense to get him comfortable. And so, yeah, when you have the insurance policy of Harold Perkins on the other side, pretty good place to be if everything holds up in the back end a little bit better for LSU over the course of the year.
Talk to me about Oregon, Dan.
Okay. Going out west?
I want to go out west because Oregon is kicking up big time dust, not just in the recruiting game with some of the guys that they've flipped, but also obviously the transfer portal has been very active in the transfer portal. Feels like Oregon has reeled in about 80% of the big names in the transfer portal so far. So where does this roster stand? What do they need? And have they addressed those needs via this recruiting cycle, either through the portal or through, freshman recruiting?
It seems they have. The clear focus is defensive line. They bring in 10 defensive linemen, I believe. Defensive line and to a lesser extent corner.
I'm sorry, 10?
10 defensive linemen. However, we're categorizing edge players, including edge type players.
10. Good
10
Lord.
defensive linemen. They hit Texas for a couple of big names. They hit Arizona for a couple of big names, Southern California. 10 defensive linemen in this coming class. I think the headline name is Mateo Uiagalelei, DJU's little brother, a.k.a. Young Concrete. Which is
Young Concrete?
Young Concrete, a wonderful nickname.
Love
they
it.
beat out USC for his services, was a two-way
Young
player in
Concrete.
high school. Yeah. And so I think he's looked at as a sort of physical marvel who is still trying to hit his potential as an edge rusher. And there's not a ton of pressure on him because you mentioned the portal. Jordan Birch coming in from South Carolina, I think is expected to get a majority of those snaps at the edge position on the Oregon defense. But with the way Oregon was not able to get a pass rush this year, it was very clear that defensive line depth, getting push inside, getting to the quarterback from the outside, from the edge, was the huge priority. The other big name is Johnny Bowens from Texas, who came on late in the process. I think he was an Army All-American or an Under Armour, one of the All-Americans, and flashed in practice there. And so he's got decent size to come in as a rotation player. But yeah, Oregon and Tosh Lupoy and Dan Lanning are going to have their choice of guys. That defensive line roster is deep, and they also return like 3 or 4 or 5 guys who started a bunch this past year. So that's the clear priority. They flipped an LSU corner on the previous signing day, Dalen Austin. They added a blue chip corner in Roderick Pleasant, who owns the California 100-meter record.
Okay.
Not me anymore. It's not my number anymore.
Ousted you.
Ran a 10-1, Roderick Pleasant. So they beat USC out for his services. So look, the issues last year were tackling and in the pass game on defense. And so they're addressing it aggressively. And so even though they took some big swings and it didn't work out for some guys on both sides of the ball, those could be, Bowens and Mateo could be rotation guys depending on how quickly the fitness is there, the ability to read and develop moves against offensive linemen is there. On the offensive side of the ball, the big one is, I don't know if he's still a 5-star, at one point was a 5-star from Northern California, Jurian Dickey. About 6'3", 210, 215. And so they lost Dante Thornton. They lost Chase Cota. They lost a couple of big names, but they hit receiver. They bring in Troy's best receiver as well through the portal. So that's a name who I think physically could be there pretty quickly from the same area where Troy Franklin's from, who's their clear number one receiver.
Number one guy, yeah.
Yeah, they're set at running back. The offensive line through the portal, I don't think there's going to be early impact guys. There's a JC guy. They hit Hawaii for an offensive lineman, but I really think it's going to be Dickey and maybe, they're thin at corner, they're thin at safety. If you remember, Peyton Bowen was a commitment for about 8.5 minutes on signing day. We'll talk about Oklahoma. So yeah, they address things on defense. Those are the two big names to me that Oregon, and we talked about this, you can look up the video as well, in terms of what Oregon needs to fix. They are aggressively going after those guys on defense and selling Dan Lanning and what he was able to do at Georgia in terms of development, in terms of system.
In terms of Dan Rubenstein's pet player, this incoming class, and I'll lump together, though, this isn't a portal show, but for the purposes of this specific debate,
right,
I'll talk about both the incoming freshmen as well as the portal. Who are the guys that you are just fascinated with? Maybe not the guys that get on the field right away. Maybe they have to wait their turn a year or two. But the names that you've been reading, that you've been hearing a lot about as you troll your message boards and the seedy underbelly that is Duck Nation. Where are you at?
The Duck Web? Yeah.
Yeah. Where are you at with respect to just the guys that you are most fascinated in?
Dante Moore still hurts, Ty.
Yeah.
Dante Moore to UCLA late in the process before the previous signing day. Now he's going to be very good for the Bruins eventually. The big name to me is when you have the type of hybrid type players on either side of the ball, right? When you have the linebacker who can be excellent in coverage, when you can have the safety who can come up and hit. On offense, to me, it's Kenyon Sadiq. I believe that's how you pronounce his name correctly. He's a tight end from Idaho, was a riser in the process, and could be that kind of at his absolute peak, right? The modern comparison would be like Kyle Pitts, the type of tight end who can run like a receiver. And so that to me is fascinating. Oregon has had some of those guys in years past where they become a matchup problem, a matchup nightmare, folks. A matchup problem. To me, that's the one that's really interesting, that he might have the athleticism to be special for an Oregon offense, at least that we saw last year use a lot of 2 tight end sets. I think there's going to be a little bit fewer of those this year with Will Stein, but still, when you have somebody like that who could potentially be a problem to linebackers, safeties, whatever, hard not to get excited. So Kenyon Sadiq from Idaho is the one that I'm extremely hopeful for works out.
Let's move over to Oklahoma.
Let's.
Oklahoma this season did not live up to expectations. Year one for Brent Venables was a bit of a mixed bag. But as I said at the top, this was a really strong effort on the recruiting trail, 4th nationally. These rankings, by the way, are shifting as we're recording this.
I'm sure. Yeah.
If I'm saying one name or one number and then it's a different number a little bit later, please forgive me. But
yeah,
right now, number 4 on the 24/7 composite charts, 3 5 stars. The big one was Jackson Arnold, the quarterback. But You also mentioned Peyton Bowen, who for a while was going to Notre Dame until he was going to Oregon and ended up at Oklahoma. So by and large, a pretty strong class. Where was their focus? Just out of curiosity, where did Brent Venables focus his energy here as he tried to build this thing brick by brick, if you have the sound?
Oh, I do have the sound, Ty. Thanks for teeing me up here.
Thank you.
Brick by brick.
In 2023.
Defense, 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 defense. And if you watched Oklahoma football this year, you know that there are jobs aplenty available.
This year, how about
Norman.
the last 5 years?
Well, no, 2020 was good. 2021, 2022, less so. And so I'm very much not going to tell you, yeah, they have 11 guys between what they did on the defensive line and in the defensive backfield in this year's class. 7 of them will see the field consistently. It's not going to work like that specifically, but in terms of a high floor, Peyton Bowen was the headliner ahead of the previous signing day. Notre Dame decommit, Oregon commit, Oklahoma commit. They've got an edge rusher. I'm just going to call it Double A because I don't want to pronounce his name incorrectly.
You know what? I've been staring at this name the entire time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to attempt it.
Adepoju Adibawore.
There's no way I'm getting this name right.
Again, it's one of those plug and play situations where he might not see the field a ton, but in very specific packages and situations, third and long, obvious passing downs, you can see somebody like him with the kind of burst that he has off of the line making a huge impact. The number 2 edge rusher in the country, 5 stars.
7-foot wingspan here.
Man, all of us great athletes have it, but yeah, it's going to be defense. It's going to be, if you saw, the back half of the defense against Texas, against TCU, whether it's Peyton Bowen, who I still think has a little bit of a ways to go physically, but I think his instincts are there to come in and sort of level things off at like a center field type position. I don't think he's going to come up and pop people in the way that a more complete safety, at the onset would, but they just need help. And they addressed a lot of things on offense through the portal. Andrell Anthony coming in from Michigan. That's not going to be as much of a priority in this year's high school class. It just seems to be defense, defense, defense. And for good reason, Brent Venables' reputation precedes him with a lot of these guys who he has a relationship going back to his time at Clemson with already. And so that to me is going to be the early impact stuff. And that to me is, if Oklahoma is going to improve, it was clearly not just a scheme thing. It was a not enough guys winning one-on-one battles all the time kind of thing when you watched Oklahoma this year. Beat up, thin, with transfers after Lincoln Riley left. But even so, I think you're going to see, maybe not this year, but the fruits of this year's class really come to play in 2024.
Yeah, an interesting metric that our friend Bill Connolly tracks is percentage of passes where the guy's wide open.
Yeah.
Wide open. Now, you could dig deep into the annals
uncontested, of
what wide open means, but by that metric, the Oklahoma defense was 125th nationally.
Yeah.
125th nationally with guys getting wide open. So whether that is a function of the line not getting pressure, they didn't do a great job getting pressure either, or if it's just not enough guys, not enough talent in the secondary, it could be a combination. It probably is a combination of both, but that's a very telling stat. And obviously something Brent Venables is trying to address here.
Yeah, and what's interesting about Oklahoma, and this is nothing new because going back to Bob Stoops, they were able to do it as well, but this isn't a program that's just going to rely on Texas and Oklahoma and Arizona and the surrounding areas. They do a pretty good job extending to California. They went up to Washington this year. They went into Florida, obviously given the roots of some of the coaches on staff. And so it makes a ton of sense that they would, they're not going to finish with a top 5-6 class every season, but it's definitely a clear example of plenty of open jobs. Come play early. Oklahoma's going to the SEC, so they're going to be on an even bigger stage in the short term that they'd be able to recruit like this. So good for Brent Venables, good for the Sooners. The future's bright. And that's not even to mention Jackson Arnold from Texas. No. And, there are corners of the quarterback recruiting world that feel like he might have the highest ceiling, especially considering, what receiver looks like moving forward, what Jeff Lebby's done with quarterbacks and offenses these past few years with Lane Kiffin and at UCF. So Jackson Arnold appears to be that kind of he's thought of in a pinpoint way. And so the future extremely bright, especially since he's not thrown to the fire this year with Dylan Gabriel coming back. I think Oklahoma's in a very, very good position to be a team that doesn't necessarily see huge changes in the win-loss column this coming season. They're going to be in a bowl game this year for sure. But you're going to see, they just blew out a team we know is decent. And that's not necessarily what we saw last year.
Where do you want to go next?
I guess we'll pair Oklahoma with Texas. I'll just keep going.
Yeah.
If that's cool with you.
I would love to hear from Texas. So the big name is Arch Manning. Arch Manning, number 1 overall recruit. Arch Manning going to Texas. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can speak to some extent about what that means for the quarterback room. Obviously, Hudson Card leaving, but Quinn Ewers is still there. That could be interesting as we get into fall camp. But, I think the book on Texas is kind of out, right? Like we had a pretty good sense for what Texas was this past season. Definitely still falling short of expectations, but I feel like the vision became a little bit clearer this season with Steve Sarkisian. It seems like Texas got better in some respects, maybe took steps back in some others, but in general, I think if you're a Texas fan, you can start to see the light a little bit. It feels like this thing is getting better. And the recruiting class is very strong. The recruiting class was 3 overall. Sark is obviously putting in the hard work there, but where are we at with Texas? How do you feel in terms of optimism about how this class adds to any momentum they established last year?
Everybody seems to recruit well at Texas. Mac Brown, Charlie Strong, Tom Herman, Steve Sarkisian, for good reason, right? It's the premier program. Apologies to Texas A&M, but it's the premier program in the state, and it attracts a good amount of talent. This year's class is no different. Arch Manning's an interesting case study because, and Brandon Huffman talked about this last year when we talked about the quarterback dominoes, and obviously on the first signing day, it's Arch Manning didn't test himself against other quarterbacks. He was not an elite 11 guy. He wasn't a camp guy. He wasn't an all-star game guy. And so played at a small private school in New Orleans. I think it's Archbishop Newman. And so we are relying on a sample size of games and projections based on lineage. And so he is not going to start this year, because starting this year would mean going to Tuscaloosa in week 2. If I'm looking at the schedule correctly, I don't think they're going to throw a true freshman into that kind of fire in his second week. It's the first year of, I think BYU and Houston are on the schedule. Quinn Ewers needs to get better, but this is not about Quinn Ewers. I think if Quinn Ewers is better in second halves and the offense is better in second halves and there's more pop outside consistently, because we saw it with Xavier Worthy, but kind of at times. He was beat up. He kind of disappeared for stretches. The offense disappeared for stretches. The story with Texas right now is how far the defense has come. And they lose a number of key pieces, especially up front. The linebacker is going to be a little bit of a new look. Good news, they bring in the number 1 linebacker in America in Anthony Hill. And so, again, I don't know if he's ready to be a 3-down type guy. It's kind of impossible to see him not being in some sort of rotation if the fitness is there, if the understanding is there, and you're not the number 1 linebacker in the country without fitness, without understanding, without the ability to have to utilize your instincts for the better as a linebacker. Is he a liability in coverage as a freshman? Probably, because all linebackers are, Ty. All linebackers are. The other early impact guy I could see, just because of what the depth chart looks like, is Cedric Baxter, a bigger running back.
Oh, yeah.
With both Roshan Johnson and Bijan Robinson moving on to the NFL.
I'm glad you mentioned him, because I was going to ask about that running back spot.
Yes, the size is there. I imagine, from what I can tell from watching highlights, that because of the way Steve Sarkisian likes using running backs in the passing game, you go back to Najee Harris, and last year, of course, with the duo of backs at Texas, if he has soft hands, if he can run, a few different routes, he might not just be a check down guy, but I could see him getting carries given the nature of the room right now. So he would be the one on offense. They have a 5-star receiver in Jonte Cook, but he seems a little bit smaller, kind of a smaller slot guy, and going after A.D. Mitchell. I think he is probably going to be more developmental as he gets bigger. But, if he is can't miss as a talent, size doesn't matter. They're just it seems to be, with Jordan Whittington coming back, in a better position at receiver right now, that they're not going to have to rely on youth.
Yeah. I mean, look, any way you slice this up, the fact that they finished third is a pretty big deal. And, there was definitely an emphasis here on key areas where they need to get better. I love Anthony Hill. I have read all year about Anthony Hill, and it feels to me like, to your point, he's somebody who could step in right away and make a pretty big impact. Same deal with Cedric Baxter. The size is there. Obviously, the acclaim is there. At one point, I saw a comp to Joe Mixon.
Okay. Yeah.
I want to say
taller back. Yeah.
For Cedric Baxter, which is obviously a pretty good comp coming into college. So, you just hope that Sark can continue organizing this ship and in year 3 get things more on the straight and narrow.
Yeah, the other big name is Malik Muhammad, local to Dallas, and given the success of Washington corners with Pete Kwiatkowski there, and really succeeding in that system, has decent enough size. I don't know if he's going to play a ton as a freshman, but somebody in the next couple of years to keep an eye on.
So here's the deal, Dan.
Please.
We're halfway through, and we're at about 48 minutes. Should we break this thing into 2?
Sure, absolutely.
So you got it. Oklahoma, Texas, LSU, Georgia, and your Oregon Ducks. The 5 teams that we are talking about here on today's show. Appreciate everybody stopping on by. On next episode, it's going to be Big Ten and Big Ten adjacent heavy. Notre Dame, Ohio State, Michigan, USC coming into.
Yeah, coming soon.
In a world coming in very, very soon. And of course, Ohio State.
Yep.
Ohio State. So, and Notre Dame. I don't know if I mentioned Notre Dame, but 5 more teams to discuss on our next episode. We appreciate everybody stopping on by. Don't forget to go on out to verballers.com. Don't forget to email us at solidverbal@gmail.com. Let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear your perspective on some of the schools that we discussed with respect to National Signing Day Part 2 and which programs address their needs the most, which players you could see. Yeah.
Building those rosters brick by brick. Is that what you were saying?
Building those rosters brick by brick.
Yeah. That's all.
Let us know. For that guy over there, my good friend Dan Rubenstein, for myself, Ty Hildebrand. Thank you so much for downloading, listening, supporting the show. As always, we will be back next week. In the meantime, stay solid.
Peace.